My name is Ben Wulf, and I'm a portrait and headshot photographer. I'm based in Greenwich in South London. So I love taking portraits and headshots. It's been excellent. I've been shooting for about 3 or 4 years now. I was an actor for about 20 years. I went to the Bristol Vic Theatre School, and I thought that was going to be most of my life, just acting. But then I always took photos for fun, especially when I was younger. Oh my God, I took loads of, I used to have lots of those old disposable cameras when I was a child, where you'd snap and then send it off and wait for the photos to come back. And I took loads of like bizarre, blurry pictures of, well, pets, flowers, all that kind of stuff. So I've always like had an interest in it, but then I had a couple of headshot sessions, and they were great. And I came away and I looked at my stuff and I was like, cool, this is good. But then I thought, I wonder if there can be, some more, I don't know, maybe you can pour some more creativity into these. Like maybe they don't have to be quite so like staid and straight ahead. And so I started taking pictures of my friends and working with more natural light and getting a grip about how that worked. And then moved on to shooting some studio photography using flash, etc. And now that's what I mainly do. And I think for me, my sort of main thrust of the work that I do is I'm really interested in trying to capture like, and this will sound a bit wafty, but somebody's essence. Like the idea that you can actually capture a bit of someone's personality and what they're really like, I think is really interesting. And again, this is not like a negative thing about other sort of styles of portraiture or headshots, but I think that like everybody is super interesting. And if you can get to a stage with somebody when you're shooting where they feel relaxed and comfortable enough to be as themselves as possible in that sphere, then I think that can be really exciting, and that's when you get some really interesting shots. I think the most important thing to me when I'm shooting portraits is, like, the goal is just to try and get as much as I can of the real person that's there. And I think that is what is relentlessly interesting, because everybody is so different, and I think that's a really active thing. I think you've got to really dial in to somebody and listen to them and get to know them, and without being intrusive, find out as much about them as you can whilst you're there working with them. Because if you don't do that, then I think possibly you just get a sort of like you get a more shallow image of somebody. But people are really interesting and really complicated, and they have so many facets to them. And I think if you can find your way in some way, and it'll always be different with different people, but find your way into what makes that person unique and interesting, and as best as you can, capture that essence, I think that's a really cool thing to do. And I don't get bored of it at all. And I love it when someone comes in, and it's relatively common, but when you get people who come in and say, oh my God, I hate this. This is my least favorite activity, having my picture taken. I can't bear it. I love it when they say that, because I think, great, like this is going to be a good challenge. And also, I think because I work in a very sort of laid back, chilled fashion, on the whole, I think people usually quite quickly forget that, obviously the camera's out and the lights are on, but they forget that they're having like a portrait or a headshot taken. So it's more about us just sat together, connecting, and whilst we're doing that, I'm snapping and we're capturing some images of them. But it's really about them just trying to be themselves for a few hours. And I think that can be a really cool thing. And that's why on the whole, I just shoot one person a day, because you never really know like how long someone's going to need. Some people need an hour, some people need 3 hours. And I don't want there to be a time pressure on somebody relaxing and trying to be themselves. It takes as long as it takes, and it's worth doing that, and people are worth that. So I just want to give them the time. And also, with outfits and stuff like that, some stuff's going to look amazing in real life. It's going to look great as you walk down the street. It's going to look great when you go out, but maybe it's not so perfect on camera. So you just want time to do different looks and change that and shave and makeup changes, hair, all that stuff. And again, I don't want people to feel pressured with that. So that's why I like that open-ended shoot time. It takes as long as it takes until we've got the looks we want, and then when we're happy, we can stop. And I guess I'm lucky that I can work that way, but that's how it works best for me. Yeah, so I think an ideal outcome for me, especially with a headshot session, is I try and ascertain what somebody needs, so what genre of the business they work in, theatre, television, film, musical theatre, commercial. So once I've kind of worked that out and what their place is in the industry, I want them to come away with some images that definitely are going to work for them, that will sell them as best I can in that world. And then I also want them to have a bit more of that's just them, that's how they maybe perceive themselves, so the more natural version of themselves. And then I also like to have different, I guess a more editorial vibe as well to come out of the session. So you've got like waist up, some full body. And these days I get a lot of recommendations, or these days I get people asking for some sort of more period shots. I feel like there's more like period drama going on these days. So I like to do a bit of that as well. But ultimately I want them to be really happy with what they've got and to come away and go, oh yeah, that's me. Like, it's so cool when their friends see their photos and they go, oh yeah, that's you. That really looks like you. That's the other thing that is quite rewarding if you can actually achieve that, because I think sometimes that doesn't happen. You get a version of yourself from a shoot, but you don't necessarily get you. And if you can get that, I think that's very cool. Send people enough photos that they can have plenty of options. So if there was a look they were like, oh yeah, that didn't really work for me, they can move outside, but they've still got plenty of other stuff to wade through. I usually send about 500 images for people to look through, which may sound like a lot, but I think people can be quite discerning and quickly get rid of the ones that they're not so into. And I also like them to come away with 4 or 5. 4 or 5 images I think is good for Spotlight. Various different looks. And that's another interesting thing. I think it's really good not just to have one style of picture. You want to show like 4 or 5 different versions of yourself, especially for Spotlight, so you can be in different casting brackets. Because obviously you'll use a different photo to be submitted for different kinds of jobs. So if you've got that variety when your sort of arsenal of photos, that's really helpful. So I always recommend when people are like picking their photos that you choose 4 or 5 really different looks. I think that's vital, because you sometimes see maybe on Spotlight you might see, okay, they've got 4 different outfits, but they're doing the same sort of blue steel for each shot. Whereas if you can show 4 like very different characters, sort of different facets of you, then I think that's ideal. I think that like everybody is super interesting, and if you can get to a stage with somebody when you're shooting where they feel relaxed and comfortable enough to be as themselves as possible in that sphere, then I think that can be really exciting, and that's when you get some really interesting shots. I think probably I've got a slightly unusual style when it comes to shoots, in that I can shoot for like 2 or 3 hours sometimes, because I think like often people are super nervous. Like, I think there's a sort of misconception that actors are super comfortable in front of the camera, but actually I think when, this is maybe a bit of a cliche, but when they just have to be themselves, I think that can sometimes feel a bit weird, and it can feel like there's a lot of pressure on it. So, I usually hang with people for sort of like half an hour, 45 minutes, having tea. I drink a lot of mint tea, just kind of getting to know them and seeing what their vibe is, to see what kind of work they're into and how they want to be perceived, etc. And usually over that period, you can start to kind of get a feel for what someone's like. And then I get stuck in. and then I always encourage people to bring as much clothing as they can, as wide a variety of things as possible. Because I think there always used to be this idea that headshots, particularly for actors, had to be very, very simple and, you know, just like very plain, basic clothing. But for me, I sort of feel like the way we express ourselves through what we wear is quite important, and it can be a big part of who you are. So I always say, like, yeah, if you wear some weird stuff, bring it, and we'll shoot it. And then if we can help show more of you, or use that to help show more of what you're like, you know, in your headshots and portraits, then that's a good thing. And, you know, I think there's still a bit of pushback against that with some people who, you know, still kind of exist in that world of, yeah, they should be very neutral. But on the whole, people aren't neutral. People are interesting, and they've got, you know, they've got interesting takes on things and a lot of stuff to offer. So yeah, I kind of encourage that as much as I can. I like to work with a lot of colour. I'm really into that. And the kind of more work I do, the more colourful I like on the whole portraits to be, because I think it adds another interesting element. Having said that, I've recently got really into shooting black and white. And I don't know, I guess there's something sort of very classical about black and white portraiture. And I kind of like that stark vibe you can get with it. It just sort of gives you like some like free drama almost, I think. So I love working with that. I don't know if the black and white headshot is back yet, but you see a bit more of it, and I see people choosing them a little bit more than maybe they used to. So I think maybe it's going to sort of creep back into the acting industry. I work with loads of canvas backdrops. Like, I'm a bit of a canvas fiend. I probably have, and this is maybe slightly embarrassing, but I've probably got close to 30 different canvas drops now. Different textures, colours, hues, sizes. I'm really into layering them now as well. I think that adds another cool dimension to portraits. And some people, yeah, I think some people think that's a bit excessive. But when you meet somebody, you immediately get a little bit of a vibe about how you set them and what's going to work well with them. So for me, if I've got all those different canvases around me, I can be chatting with them and think, okay, cool. This is going to work with you well, or this is going to work with the textures of what clothing you're wearing, etc. So I just love having the options. And also, just personally, I think they're really lovely things to have around. Like, my studio is full of them. They're everywhere. And yeah, they're just sort of like, I guess I'm quite tactile. So yeah, I like the textures of them, and I sort of just like having them there looming about the studio. And there's a few really good makers. Like, I love Artery. They consistently make really nice drops, good color, and lots of different makers I use sort of mid-Eastern Europe. I used to make my own, and I made a few, and there's a couple that I use, but I think they're a bit deceiving. I think it looks simple, but the really nice ones where the textures and the colors are really layered, it's an art, definitely. And they can be a bit pricey, but on the whole, I don't think I've ever regretted any of the backdrops I've bought. So yeah, there's definitely an interesting thing about, like, when I'm working with actors, a big thing is like, well, so what kind of work do you do? Do you work in theatre? Do you work in telly? Are you more of commercial, musical theatre? Because obviously musical theatre is a very different space. Like, with headshots, they're usually a lot brighter and cleaner. It's a cleaner vibe, I think, in that world. But I think overall, for me, my sort of quest when I'm shooting, if you will, is if I can just capture a few like real moments, you know, they're super comfortable with you, and you can get those like little flashes here and there of what their body language is really like once you've like stripped away people's sort of shields. I think that's fascinating, and then you can get some really cool photos. But then it's also useful to get the range, and I think that's what's really like nice about having the luxury of shooting for a long time, is that you can try and nail a straight ahead. This is what I look like on an excellent day, presentable headshot, and then you can weave in and out of doing different styles, stuff that's a bit more eccentric, perhaps a little bit more posy, more chilled, whatever. And then I just love that. I mean, I was chatting to a photographer yesterday who was saying, like, how many photos do you send people? And I'd say on average, I probably send out about 500 odd pictures for people to choose from. Because I think, you don't have your headshots done every day. You don't have portraits taken all the time. So if you can get as much out of a session as possible, then, I think you should. And if you can have that variety, and especially now, when social media is so important for most creatives, it's not just about having those headshots and portraits that you're going to use on Spotlight or whatever it is you use to sell yourself as an actor or a singer or an artist, but you need sort of some more editorial stuff that you'll be using on your various socials and websites and stuff too. So if I can offer that along with a standard headshot portrait session, I think that's really cool. So I try and do that as much as I can, which is also why I often throw in some black and white sort of sessions as well when I'm shooting, because again, it gives you another option of work that you can use to help sell yourself, which I think is ultimately why you're getting those shots done. I also because I was an actor for so long, I still really like actors. Like, it's still really fascinating talking to them about what kind of work they do and how they work and how they spend their time and what their place in the industry is. Environmental portraits are brilliant because you can feed in the surroundings of partly what makes somebody the way they are, I think, and there'll be an inference of that onto them. There's something about seeing all the contraptions and the things that surround somebody in their workplace that can then really support the portrait. And I love looking at the structure of that and how you're going to frame that. Like, I shot a therapist the other day in her studio, and she had a really lovely space. And I'm not sure if she'd realised, but she kind of matched all the contrasting colours really well. So with a bit of tinkering, we got her. She had this really nice warm energy about her. But then we were able to sort of see her in her lair, in her therapist's lair, and that just adds so much more to the photo rather than just having that, having like a plain, here's me against a white backdrop. So you get, I think if you're going to visit someone like that, you then get to see, okay, this person's like this, and also this is their environment, which is then going to help you make a decision about whether you're going to go to them or not. And I think, so that's really helpful for them, but also, I guess, selfishly, very interesting for me. And maybe also, because I come from a theatrical background, some of these people's workspaces, I sort of think and look at like their sets. Like if you're going to shoot a chef in their kitchen, in a way it almost doesn't feel completely real, because I'm trying to look at it from a sort of an arty sort of perspective. So you sort of think how that might be on stage and how it might look and how you might dress it. And then there's a slightly strange thing, I guess, if you're doing one of those environmental portraits where you might start then moving things around a little bit so they're maybe not what they might be in real life, but obviously it's going to be aesthetically more pleasing. But that's really fun. Photographers I really love, one of the photographers I go back to over and over again at the moment, even though, he does shoot portraits, but his houses, so Todd Hydo, is exceptional. And a photographer called Chris Mann put me onto him because he loves him. And those buildings at night, I just find them endlessly fascinating. And he's amazing because you'll look at his pictures and some people might be like, oh, it's just a house at night. But he somehow is able to pour a whole narrative into those photos. I think he does long exposures. I think he drives around, or certainly when he's making some of them, drives around at night, he'll park up, and then he'll take a long exposure of a house that he finds in some way interesting, and then you can just stare at these photos for, well, maybe not hours, but certainly for like, I've looked at some for like half an hour at a time. There's quite a famous one where I think it looks like there are two people watching television in this house in different rooms. There's that kind of blue sort of TV light on their faces. Well, not their faces, but you can see it in the windows. And there's this whole thing he's got in his head of like, well, okay, so there's people in this house, but they're not sitting together. Like, why are they not sitting together? What are they watching? What's going on? They're so moody. I guess he does a lot of sort of like bleaker landscapes as well, but again, they're very cinematic. So I'm always drawn to him. He also speaks really eloquently about the photos he takes and how he works in post, etc. And I find that really interesting. And he does some great sort of quite stark nudes as well, and portraits that are quite basic. He'll do like sort of those sort of slightly gritty motel shots that are, again, have a sort of tragic feel to them, but they're so beautiful. And with very little, he's a bit like, because some of his photos were used for some Raymond Carver books. He's a writer who I love, who, again, with short stories, tells you a hell of a lot, and you fill in all the gaps. And I think, yeah, they use some of his photos for that, because he has a similar vibe with his photographs. Looking at some of his portraits, his models, they're not technically doing a lot, but the way he's framed it all, you get a huge story. And that's really clever, I think. I don't know how much time he puts into that, whether he's just got a nose for it, but yeah, he's a very clever photographer. I think he's probably my favorite, I would say. I mean, I love Dan Winter's stuff. Dan Winters is brilliant. All the work, I mean, he's a great set builder. And I think he built a lot of himself from what I can remember. And he's got a wicked book called Road to Seeing, which any photographer should read, I think, because it's really inspirational. I like the way he talks about his process and why he takes photos, and I don't know, I guess some people might suggest that some of it's a bit, I don't know, there's a negative connotation with things being, a bit self-helpy or something these days. But he just cares about it, and it's nice to listen to someone sort of write or talk about something they care about, and sort of not being ashamed of that. And you don't get the feeling like he just does it for the money or as a means to an end. He really cares about the portraits he's making, and that's cool. That's a good thing. I'm in Boston because my girlfriend is in a show. She's in the Life of Pi, so she's out here doing some puppeteering. So I had a couple of weeks to come out, so I thought I'd hang out and take some street photos and get a feel for what Boston's like. And then there's some photographers out here who I've sort of been chatting to on and off on Instagram for a few years now. So I thought it'd be so nice to kind of hang out and see how they work and just meet them in real life. And what has been lovely is I've chatted to a couple of photographers here, and sometimes there's a bit of a secretive vibe that goes on where I think people don't want to see what equipment they use or where they put their lights and all that kind of stuff. And I've been chatting with Walter, and that's been great because he's not afraid to tell me about how he works. And my name's Ben Wulf, and I'm from London. Boom.
How was that?
Yeah, it was good.
That's pretty cool, eh?
That was cool. I like the moving around stuff. It's funny though, it's quite like, you've just become so aware of...
You're just talking.